And let me just sort of tell you what our objectives are for the evening today. We really tried to design this program so that we could best share our stories with you with an eye towards giving you some teachable moments from our experience, right? Fraud examiners, investigators, receivers, and bankruptcy trustees, all of us and fraud examiners, all of you guys are on a constant adventure, right? We have stories about fraud that you just can't make up. And sometimes our experiences turn out surprisingly well, and other times, not quite as well. So we wanted to share some of those experiences with you today, with any words of wisdom that we might have along the way about what we did right or what we did wrong, so that maybe we can all learn from them. We want to walk through some of the more defined parts of a typical case, maybe a typical receivership case, but it really translates to any kind of a case. The circumstances can arise. Sometimes a fraud examiner, for example, is asked to come into an operational company when some type of fraud is suspected. And so the business operations are ongoing, and that examiner is going to start interviewing people and seeing what's up. Other times, the company might be shut down by a federal regulator on suspicion of fraud. They go into court and they shut the business down, not on notice to anybody, and a receiver is appointed. Or sometimes a case ends up in bankruptcy, and sometimes that's voluntarily, and sometimes that's involuntarily, and then a bankruptcy trustee gets appointed. Or sometimes a private investigator is needed in any one of those scenarios to really find out some of the facts. So before we dive into our stories, Olivia, why don't you just talk to us a little bit about when a private investigator would be needed as opposed to a certified fraud examiner?
Both of us, both groups, both private investigators and fraud examiners or forensic accountants dig for dirt. I mean, we dig for information. So we're very much involved in finding hard to get facts. And we very much complement one another. So a private investigator may be able to dig for information that a forensic accountant doesn't have access to. Typically, a forensic accountant will have, through subpoena, will have books and records and financial information that a private investigator does not have. But frequently, a forensic accountant may not know the interrelationships of the various parties. So they may have a canceled check from Olivia Robinson, but not know whether I'm a bad guy or a good guy. And so they are able to trace the flow of money through the paperwork or the documentation. But we're able to supplement or complement that through proprietary databases or through surveillance or through a number of other methodologies. So it's very much a complementary kind of relationship. And we work a lot with forensic accountants and bring them in when we can't do what they do. So.
Okay, good, thank you.
Yeah.
So just for kicks and to get us started, why don't you each tell us about your favorite or your most creative fraud that you've had in your experience? Steve, what's yours?
Well, yeah, I've handled a number of cases involving all sorts of different frauds. I think one really stands out. It was a case I had involving the SEC, and this goes back to way back when anthrax was a thing, and also when HIV was not as well understood. And so the perpetrator of this fraud factored latex glove receivables because he said everybody in the world is going to need latex gloves when they open the mail, and everybody's going to need to wear gloves because, back 25 years ago, whenever this was, 20 years ago, HIV, AIDS, some people were still paranoid in terms of how it's transmissible. And he ended up raising $270 million from 8,000 some odd people in 13 different countries. and he provided about 20% returns. The fraud lasted about 8 years. He paid everybody back like clockwork, and the fraud began to unwind based on somebody doing a little snooping. But this was an evil genius to raise almost $300 million. And there was never a single latex glove, not one, ever, nowhere.
And Steve, wasn't it that if you had calculated based on the dollar amount that was flowing, what percentage of gloves of the world's universe of gloves would have been produced by him?
Yeah, if somebody had just done a little bit of homework, the amount of receivables that this individual said that he was making money off of based on factoring, it would have been something like 60 or 70% of the entire world's production of gloves at that time.
Okay, yeah, that was a pretty clever one. David, what about you? What's your favorite?
So I'm going to answer that. Before I do, I'm going to just mention to everyone, Manja. My wife just brought me my dinner. I hope you guys are enjoying it. It's great having everybody here. It's awful that we can't see each other, but Manja, salud. So I had a case not nearly as big as 60% of the world's market in latex gloves, but it was a commercial painting contractor down in San Diego County. And it was clear that this enterprise, it was like a $2 million, $1.5 to $2 million enterprise gross revenue. It was a young company. It was a young guy that was running it. And he knew, he just could tell by looking at his bank account at the end of the month that, something was wrong, because he was making revenue. He was showing profits accrual, but he was bouncing checks, and there were bill collectors calling him. And he had a older lady that kept the books, who was seemingly very uninitiated computer-wise, not somebody who seemed to display any great characteristics of computer proficiency. But she was stable. She was very reliable. Two of the facts that I took into account quite quickly were that she came in very early in the morning, about 6:30 each morning. And she said, because she liked to get her work done while it was quiet and she didn't have any interruptions, and she had never taken a vacation. And through a process of analyzing the records, we began to look at payroll. I mean, it was just really one of the things that was on our checklist anyway, and reconciling the payroll draws to the, they kept I think it was Great Plains software, accounting software. And this is going back to the 2000s, the double O's. And it was at a time when, electronic transfers and electronic banking were not so sophisticated. The woman had figured out a way to intercept the outbound payroll instructions. The computer software would generate a file on the C drive of the computer, of her computer. It's called a NACHA file, N-A-C-H-A. And if you can open it up with like your notepad, you can open it up, and any of us who were to open that would just see these strings of numbers and characters and nonsense, really. She had figured out a way to open those NACHA files and adjust the amounts that she was receiving into her bank account. And she knew enough about accounting and bookkeeping that she was able to make necessary adjusting entries, so that the gross amounts were balancing out, but she was receiving amounts, we're talking in the $5,000 to $10,000 a month range, but it added up over a period of time. We were never able to completely determine how much it was, but it was striking the level of ingenuity with it, and that she was just the completely unsuspecting suspect. That one has always stayed in my mind.
You know, if people would just use that level of intelligence for good instead of evil, what a world it would be. Olivia, do you have a favorite story?
I do. It took place in Utah, and the work was for a criminal litigator. And he had a client that had been thrown under the bus in a plea deal. The two partners had a marijuana ranch, and the guy that did the plea deal said that he wasn't part of the marijuana scheme at all, and he put all the blame on the fellow that was very unhappy. So as part of their trial, his name is, what is his name here? Hold on. Martin, who he also went by a number of other names, but Martin claimed that he had never had any run-in with the law before, and he was squeaky clean. And so the question for me was, has Martin had any issues in his past? And it wasn't too long before I discovered that Martin had been incarcerated 3 times. He was incarcerated in LA County, also Terminal Island, and then Brixton Prison in London. And I learned this because one of the first people that I interviewed was a woman that belonged to a private investigative association that I belonged to. And she was formerly with the, who was she with? She was with the, well, heavens. She was with immigration, and but she was looking for a new job. So I said, well, I can't offer you a full-time job, but I can certainly ask for assistance here on a short gig. So she looked up and verified these 3 incarcerations, and we went from there. I ended up interviewing people all over the world, trying to track down whether these were the full extent of it or whether there were additional issues that we could put into our Utah court filing. And I discovered that while Martin was at Brixton Prison, he had a prisoner cellmate that was quite famous, and they were in the gold business together. And I learned this by looking at the archives on newspapers all over the world, and spent a lot of time looking at British papers, and discovered that his cellmate was Goldfinger. And this was the real Goldfinger that the movie was made out of. And the 2 of them, they were on a tape together, a BBC tape that I've discovered. And they became famous in part because they smuggled gold Krugerrands, the South African Krugerrands, into the UK when it was illegal for them to do it. And basically the concern was that it would jeopardize the economy of the UK if these things were flooding the market. Martin and Goldfinger became famous with their Rolls Royces because they would stick the gold Krugerrands in the sidewalls of the Rolls Royce and smuggle them in that way. So it was pretty enterprising. One of the people that I talked to was the skipper of a yacht in Greece, and he sailed all around the Greek islands. And one of his passengers at one point was Martin. And Martin got on the yacht armed with his gold Krugerrands, unbeknownst to the yacht owner. And the authorities, the Greek authorities, were following them from one island to another, and eventually caught up with them. But before the authorities actually cracked down, Martin skipped town with his Krugerrands and left the yacht owner and his wife to face the charges. And so he was a very unhappy camper, this yacht owner. I interviewed gold purveyors, people that owned gold companies all over the world. And it's a very closely knit industry. And so people tend to know one another and they watch out for one another, because if there's a bad guy, it brings down the image of the entire industry. And so this fellow took my questions very seriously. And I'm going to read you something that this is from the Daily Mail in the UK from 1977. He put a notice in saying, our recollection of this company, he's talking about Martin's company, was somewhat vague, and we would be grateful for anybody with more detailed knowledge to contact us and help fill in the blanks. So obviously he was trying to help me in my Utah case by getting additional dirt on Martin. And he talks about how the yacht owner the yacht was seized by the Greek Navy and was involved in a Greek currency smuggling charge. So it wasn't just Martin that eventually was charged, but it was the yacht owner too. So that's my favorite.
All right. Oh, that's a good one. That's also quite intricate. I just noticed, I don't know if anybody said at the beginning of the presentation, it is being recorded. I see the little recording thing on. So I just wanted, if anyone doesn't want to be recorded and have their name on the screen, hang up now.
Okay.
All right, great. So thank you guys. I mean, it just tells you, you know, a fraud can involve anything, right? I mean, all three of those stories are so incredibly different. So let's think about, like, for example, in a federal equity receivership case, right? When the government goes in on the sly, everything's under seal, and they're going to surprise the perpetrator and shut down the business. And, you know, your job as a fraud examiner or the receiver or the private investigator is to figure out what happened and to piece it all together. What does that first day look like? You know, I mean, I've been involved in these takedowns, right? And you meet at the Walmart parking lot down the street, and you have your videographer and your computer forensics guy, and sometimes the U.S. Marshals come, or the postal inspectors, you know, if they think that the people are armed and dangerous. And I had one of these cases. In fact, it was representing Steve, who had to not be there that first day, and so he had sent his father, and they're there with their guns, or like, they're armed and dangerous. We have an army of 20 professionals ready to go in, and the, you know, the postal inspector's like, you know, we think we should go in first because they're armed and dangerous. And Jim Donnell puts his arm around me. He says, nope, me and my lawyer, we're going in first. And so we walk in, and I'm thinking, oh my God, what are we walking into? There were like 3 people in the place. We so overpowered them. You never know what you're going to find when you walk in that first day. Steve, what's your favorite story of a takedown that way?
Well, you know, you literally never do know what you're going to find on the first day. I'll tell you two quick funny stories. One particular case, if people remember, a number of years ago, somebody crashed an Enzo Ferrari on PCH, wrapped it around a light pole, and it split in half. By the way, that car ended up selling, I believe, for over $1 million after it was repaired. This individual was from Sweden, and he was a criminal and has been convicted, so I can say that. And the state of California appointed me as receiver to seek restitution for the people. And one of the things that my team and I did is we went to Beverly Hills to his very, very large home. By this time, he had fled, I believe, to England. And so we show up not knowing what to expect. And to make a long story short, he had been operating a high-end brothel in this Beverly Hills mansion. And the workers were all there. They were all very lovely. And they really had a great time with me, where I was trying to be very professional and say, you know, you've got to pack up, you've got to leave. And let's just say that all of the tools of their trade were just everywhere in the bathroom. I mean, I literally, my face were shades of red, but they were literally having to put all their things away. It was pretty, pretty memorable. Another quick story in terms of a takeover. I work with a lot of forensic accountants. I'm not sure who I spend more time with, my lawyers, my forensic accountants, or my wife and children. It's pretty evenly split. But at one of the takeovers that I did in a case involving the Federal Trade Commission, who themselves typically do the computer imaging, and they had their team in place, and they were imaging the hard drives and you know, chain of custody, and everything's very formal, and we really couldn't do much at all. My forensic accountant sits down at one of the desks, you know, innocently, and his phone was running out of batteries. And so he took his USB cable and he plugged it into the monitor so he could charge his phone. And one of the agents looked up and looked around, said, whose phone is that? And my forensic accountant raised his hand and said, well, that's mine, I'm charging it. And he said, I won't repeat his name, but he said, sir, your metadata on your phone is now part of the evidence in this United States District Court federal case. And we will now have to do a special report on, you know, this contamination of the evidence. And he wasn't joking. So the moral of the story there is, don't try to charge your phones on any equipment during a takeover with the feds. And it's something that he never has forgotten. And every time he and I have lunch, it's something I never let him forget either. We're good buddies, and it's a story that we'll laugh about for years to come.
Yeah, see, now that's one of those stories. That's why we're doing this panel today. So none of you have to suffer that same embarrassment. Oh, who knows? Who would think about that? So Steve, is it safe to assume that you made the decision not to continue to operate the Beverly Hills business?
Yeah.
That's a safe assumption. Yes. Yes.
All right. So also, you know, when you do a takedown like that, the first day, there often are employees there, and I'm sure all of us have had some experience in how those employees react. And I'd be curious to know if any of you have any stories about any assets walking out the door or being attempting to walk out the door in a situation like that. David, do you have anything?
Well, not in a receivership, but I don't know if has anybody here ever used the Los Angeles County Sheriff's Keeper? Has anybody on the panel ever done that? Have you ever done that? Have you ever even heard of installing a keeper?
Yes.
No.
Okay. Don't do it. I can tell you for sure. I mean, when you talk about things literally walking out the door, we did a sheriff's keeper on a judgment debtor corporation, was a furniture factory in, you know, central LA area. And you pay a certain amount for the keeper. The keeper collects all the revenue that comes in the door over about a 3-day period. And then afterwards, if ordered to, he's supposed to seize everything in the premises. And this guy they sent out was like, and I think it's pretty common, the people that they send out that work as keepers are retired sheriff's deputies, people who had previously been employed like as process servers, that kind of thing. And this guy was just the most passive, ineffectual person. My client, the judgment creditor, was so disgusted. I was there, I was sitting outside watching. I tried to go in. The fellow basically pushed me out the door, but I'm watching the premises, and he goes in within about 60 minutes. The back door of the factory, literally, big sliders open up, they back up a truck and just start loading inventory in.
Wow.
And I'm immediately on the phone with the sheriff's office complaining, and just, you know, total, you know, ineffectual response, you know, commentary to the effect that, oh, don't worry, this guy is really good, he's going to take care of you, don't worry about it. So moral of that one, if you are ever in a position where you're considering installing a keeper in LA anyway, don't bother with it. It was one of the most worthless exercises I've ever been through.
Huh, interesting. All right, good to know. Good to know. But that's what receivers are for. So Steve, what about you as a receiver?
Well, there was the same case, the case involving the Latex Glove receivables. This individual had about 30 employees, had a full floor office building, a full floor in an office building in Pasadena. And so when we did the takeover, I fortunately had security with me, and we had security in the common areas, corridors, as well as in the lobby. And you go in and you don't know what you're going to find. And so we're in there for the first 15, 20 minutes, and I was told that the quote unquote owner was not there. And so we're beginning to interview people, and all of a sudden somebody tapped me on the shoulder and said, there's somebody that was leaving in the hallway. We don't know who he is. And so I went out and talked to him, and he was a very unassuming individual. And the hallway sort of dead-ended, but there was a door. And as it turned out, the door was one of the interior exits to the office space. And so I said, well, you must have come from inside there. And he said, no, I'm just walking around. And I said, no, you're not. You need to come with me. And he gave me a little bit of a hard time, and he was carrying a couple of large duffel bags. And so I said, I need to see those. And as it turns out, this very unassuming gentleman in very casual clothing, he was the main perpetrator.
Wow.
He was the owner of the company. He was the main perpetrator. And in his duffel bag were about 100 small notebooks. And he had had them custom made. And on the front of every notebook was called Larry's Black Books. And his name was Larry. And he was meticulous to a fault about registering all of the income and expenses as a duplicate for his computer entries. And literally, it was the keys to the kingdom. My forensic accountant said that without Larry's Black Books that he was trying to run away with, that the job for the forensics would have been virtually impossible because of the transfers in and out, and that the entries were done purposely to evade and to make it that much more confusing. But his Black Books, they virtually balanced to the penny every month, and they were for 7 years of transactions. So if I hadn't come with guards and we hadn't caught him, the case would have been very, very different. It traced money to foreign countries, other states. So I'll never forget that. Thank you, Larry. What a help you were.
That's amazing. It just goes to show that first day, being on heightened alert, asking questions, looking for suspicious activity, because that's the day when you're most likely to lose an asset. I had a case where we took it over, and all the employees were sort of shuttled into a conference room and kind of locked down. And one just sweet employee, so I just have to get something personal out of the safe. So we actually let them open the safe, because that led us into the safe. And there was this diamond-studded tiara. It was beautiful, several $100,000. Oh, that's mine. We're like, really? Why don't you show us the receipt? And so, of course, it wasn't, and it was, property that had been purchased with fraudulent funds. So we ended up keeping it. But yeah, you never know. You got to ask a lot of questions. All right. So once you get past that, the first day in a case like that, in any kind of a case, often you're looking for what went missing, right? You're looking for asset recovery because there's some type of a victim, whether it's a company that you're trying to get stolen, embezzled funds back from, or in a receivership for the defrauded victims in an investor scheme, that type of a thing. So sometimes we really encounter some unusual and surprising assets. So why don't you guys tell us about something unusual that you've recovered, and what happened, how you lucked out, or what skills you used to find it. Olivia, do you have a story?
I do. Mine is a story about a young woman, a dentist, and she called me and she said, I'm missing my grandmother. And so I said, well, where do you think she is? And she says, I don't know. I've been looking for her for years. And I said, well, if you had to guess where she might be, what would you suggest? Well, she was very reluctant to speak honestly. And I can understand why after the whole case kind of unfolded. She was part of a really dreadful family. And it was one side of the family against the other. They were in litigation, endless litigation with one another. And the grandmother, Patricia, had been very wealthy. She owned a farm, and the farm was sold when Patricia started showing signs of dementia. And the family then went into overdrive in terms of fighting over the assets. And so that was sort of the background. Patricia's son, a 50-year-old son, Richard, had autism. And the two had lived together ever since Richard was born. And so they were always together. Richard was able to do menial kind of work, as in like pushing a broom and that kind of thing. But he wasn't able to manage money or to handle his own assets, let alone his mother's. So that was sort of the background. And the more that I got into it with my client, she described the real family hostilities, and she mentioned a number of possibilities. So I looked up addresses and found sort of a map of where Patricia might have been, and it covered 5 different states. And so the thought was that Patricia and Richard were being held against their will. But, we didn't have any proof. And so I talked to a number of people with prosecuting elder abuse cases. And the thought was to try and get the U.S. Attorney's Office involved in each one of these different states to see whether they couldn't raid the homes at a designated time simultaneously. Well, in some of the states, some of the jurisdictions, they just weren't equipped to do raids. They hadn't even heard of raids for elder cases. And so that wasn't going to work. So I called the police departments in each jurisdiction and asked for a wellness check at each address. And the wellness checks all came up nothing. I mean, there was no sign that Patricia had been there except in Nevada. And she and Richard had been in Nevada for a short period of time, but then they disappeared. So at least that was a lead. And some of the police departments were very cooperative. Others were not, because I wasn't a relative. But we kept trying to find out where in the world she was. We went to churches, we did all kinds of things. And ultimately we gave up because I couldn't find her. And a couple of months later, I received a call from an officer from a department in Illinois. And he said, Olivia, I want you to know that I have Patricia sitting right here. And so he called me asking whether I knew of a relative that I could talk to and they could come and get her. And so, of course, I was just giddy that he'd found her. It turns out that her son, Richard, the 50-year-old, had been murdered, brutally murdered and mutilated. And his parents were at the coroner's office trying to ram through a cremation. And the coroner became very suspicious about the urgency for this and the fact that the parents were so anxious to have it done quickly. And Patricia was there with the parents. And here she is with her dementia and not knowing what was going on. So the coroner called the police department, and then the police department called me. So that was a fabulous outcome, except for poor Richard. It was a fabulous outcome for the good side of the family.
Well, that's yeah, that's an interesting asset. That's a human being. So yeah, that's a good story. All right. David, what about you? Oh, you're on mute.
Sorry about that. So nothing quite so bloody, but it definitely ties in also with, you know, the tactics, the creative ways that people use to uncover assets. When Olivia was talking about the difference between forensic accountants and private investigators, I was thinking, you know, when I was a private investigator, I don't think I told the truth to anybody the entire time I was working. But as an accountant, you know, we got to get on the stand, so we can't get into that. But a typical kind of, you know, procedure that we would use as an investigator, you know, back in the day when I was plying the trade, you know, I had to locate this guy. I was working for the subrogation section of Royal Insurance, and he had they had a large judgment against him, and he was missing. And in those days, we used to get the crisscross directory and start calling the neighbors, and a typical under a suitable pretext. And so a typical kind of call like this would go, yeah, this is Dan Evans from UPS Main Dispatch. We're trying to make a delivery to your neighbor, Mr. John Doe, and he's not home. Do you have any idea where we can find him? And just go through the list, try to get neighbors talking. And in this instance, I found a lonely old man sitting at home at his house in Malibu, who knew the neighborhood quite well, knew the neighbor very well, knew everything that was going on in the neighborhood. And I got him on the phone and just talked to him and just let him talk. And he talked to me for about 30 minutes, and he had seen the moving van come when the judgment debtor had moved out of the property. And he gave me a description of everything that had come out that door and gone into the moving van, which included a ton of weapons, a ton of guns, laser scope equipment, and that he also knew that they were all kept in this certain safe, a very large, distinguishable safe. So I was able to write an inventory based upon everything that he said, ultimately located where the judgment debtors were living, and went in with the United States Marshal Service with an inventory that included in great detail these guns, laser scope equipment, and that locker that they were kept in. And lo and behold, they were all there when we got there. And the judgment debtor was just incredulous. He couldn't understand. He came up to me and he said, just tell me this. Did you find these things out through a machine or through a human being? He couldn't.
Wow, yeah, that's a nice gift, but interviewing the neighbors, yeah, well, yeah, you just lucked upon one that was staring out the window. Fascinating. Okay, and Steve, what about you? Any surprising finds?
Yeah, I've taken over so many different things. I mean, literally planes, boats, yachts, lots of exotic cars, jewelry. One that stands out is a different fraud case. I took over the office. It was up in the valley, and yeah, pretty basic vanilla office. There are about 20 employees. There's a very large fish tank, and one of the employees, after we told him we were going to be shutting everything down and we were going to be locking everything up, and we got the passwords and security and everything, I noticed that he was very adamant that he wanted to be able to come back and feed the fish, and that he was offering to help to do so. And I don't know anything about fish, but there were a lot of fish. It was a big fish tank. And he said he would, give him a key, and he'd come in on the weekend. They have to be fed all this special food. And so something just struck me, odd. And so I don't know, there was a fish store, up there in the valley, like on Parthenia, or, one of the streets up in the valley. And so I went to, after the takeover, it was in the afternoon, I went to the store, and I explained to the owner what had happened and that I might need to get some care and feeding some fish. And he said, well, let me come on over. So he did. He came over and he looked at the fish and he said that the fish that were in this fish tank were probably had a market value of probably over $10,000. It was shocking. And so I suspect that the individual that was offering to help knew this, and he was wanting to perhaps relocate the fish without my knowledge. So that one was definitely interesting. I had another situation in terms of finding assets. I had a case where this was not a federal case, it was a state court case, but a lender had me appointed because of a default on on a series of loans on some equipment, and the owners had moved the equipment from California over to the Midwest, and I flew to the Midwest to Ohio. I found one location and they had left and it was empty. And I was looking through the office and I just found an obscure note about a phone number, and it said that it was a real estate agent. And the note looked pretty new, it was clean. So I called the agent and he said, oh yeah, I know about that company. They were gonna relocate last week to a space that I had for them and they decided not to. And I said, well, do you know where they went? And they said, yeah, they went down to Indiana. So I said, do you know where? And sure enough, somehow he knew where they were. So I went down to Indiana and they had left a couple of days before, and I ended up chasing him up to Chicago and then found some things there, and then also found some equipment. We're talking millions of dollars of equipment that they had also stored up in Canada. So, you never know these little obscure pieces of paper. Had I not found the real estate broker that put me in touch with the location in Indiana, that led me up to Chicago and Wisconsin, I'm not sure that I would have recovered half as much.
Yep, and sometimes, it's just dumb luck. Here we are trying to dispense some, wisdom in our clever ideas, but sometimes it's just luck. I had a case, when you think about asset tracing, and I'll ask you guys about any asset tracing stories. I had a case, $2 million was lost, and I just kept missing it. I would send a subpoena and the money was there, but it had already left. And then I'd send a subpoena to the next place. And I'm just going around the country and back. And I just had one banker call me up one day at some financial institution in Illinois. And he said, I got your subpoena and I don't have an account in that name. And I was like, okay, why are you calling me? Well, because my subpoena had requested very specific dollar amounts, two very large dollar amounts, like $807,352.03. Well, he had two deposits in those exact dollar amounts, but in another name. And I don't know what possessed this banker to pick up the phone and call me and tell me the name of the bank account, but he did. So I was able to get a subpoena and an emergency, order, an injunction freezing that money so it wouldn't move anymore. But after, $1 million in fees, or no, I'm probably not that much, but a year of spending it, just some guys happen to call me up and tell me, right? So sometimes we just get lucky. David, do you have any asset tracing stories that you can share?
Yeah, I have a couple. I tend to think of luck as being a residue of diligence, just constantly asking and constantly pushing and really, simply never giving up, kind of just shaking the tree until, something shakes loose. I did have a couple of cases in which there were some interesting tracing aspects involved. I was in a case, it was an entertainment business contract case that turned into a judgment enforcement case. And it was against a small-time movie production company. That company also owned some real estate, owned a little editing and some facilities over on Cole in Hollywood. And we had a judgment against him about 1.2 million. There was fraud in the underlying case. Between the time that the jury had rendered the judgment and the time that the court clerk had entered the judgment, They received a check. It was about $250,000. It was made out in the name of the production company, and but it was never cashed in the company accounts. And you could go and you could examine the books of this company. You were never going to find those checks. But through my operation of just getting out and asking a lot of questions, kind of like Columbo, I guess, just constantly poking around and developing new information, we developed a lead from a client down in San Diego, and I reached out to them. We put a subpoena ducis tecum on them, and they were so voluntary. It's kind of like your banker. They were so ready to give these people up for whatever reason. The defendants, the judgment debtors were kind of, we weren't the only ones. They had ripped off a string of people in the movie business for years. So there were a lot of people who were, kind of ready to turn over information. So we got these checks, and they had been endorsed and then cashed into the personal bank account of the 3 children of the owner of the film company, and cashed at a bank in Minnesota. But we were able to get front and back duplicates. We initiated a new civil suit against the children, who were not involved. They didn't want to have anything to do with this. They were like, one of them was a city attorney. One of them was like a suburban mom. So they're going to settle. They ended up having to settle that case. I have a few others, but let's let some of the other panelists jump in.
All right. Well, I don't know. Does anyone have a good asset tracing or like a big windfall, like you really lucked out on a case? I'll share one. I was representing an SEC appointed receiver, and it was a $300 million fraud. And, we were doing everything we can to cobble together some money to get a distribution back to the victims. And the perpetrator had fled the country. He was prohibited, there was a criminal investigation. He was prohibited from leaving. He left anyway. He went to France. Well, they detained him when he got off the plane in France, and they put him in French prison, which I'm told is not the best place to have to sit in prison, awaiting extradition. But he was sitting there for a good while, like the whole time I was involved in the case, a year or two in, and then he died of a heart attack, which was, obviously sad. He didn't get to see his family or anything, but from the receiver's standpoint, he actually had a $30 million life insurance policy that we didn't know about, that had been paid for with stolen and corporate funds. So that was a nice little windfall for us, things that you don't expect to happen. Anyone else have a lucky windfall situation? No.
So I'll mention one other on that film production case. One of the other things that I did on that case was I went back and searched real property records, and I searched back a total of 7 years, because this is going back. This was under the old Uniform Fraudulent Transfer Act, the state law. And the new act, the Uniform Voidable Transfers Act, similarly, it has a 7-year catch-all. And so a lot of people don't really bother with this. I went back and conducted a search for transfers going back 7 years. And this dated from a time before my client had ever even begun her contractual relations with the company. But we found that the company had owned another piece of real estate, and likewise had done a grant deed for zero consideration to those same 3 children. And it was almost 7 years to the day prior that we got our suit filed for that second fraudulent transfer. And that was a property that was worth in excess of the amount of the judgment. The judgment, remember, was 1.2. This property alone was was more than that, put it to you that way. This was gonna make us whole if we would reclaim the entirety of that. Another crucial aspect of that was I was able to determine from public records, the IRS was after them, contemporaneous to that transfer, which was a demonstration of intent. Might not have been the strongest case. It didn't go to trial, but they were forced to settle. Both of those cases survived summary judgment. It ended up in a Chapter 11, but the defendants, those children, were made to settle out both of those cases. So the the moral there was go back and check 7 years. There was a justification that we had. The transfers, although you could find them in the public record, the name had been concealed and the defendants had lied about the true name of their corporation to us. So we were able to, get a valid suit going, even though the transfer had taken place nearly 7 years prior.
I mean, David, that is such a great practice pointer because most of us don't do that. You think, oh, 4 years, the statute's really 4 years. But yes, there are mechanisms to take it back further. And anyone who's really intent on, hiding a transfer, they're just going to push that as long as they can. So great practice point. That's a good point. What about your biggest missed opportunity? Looking back, it's like, what you coulda, shoulda, woulda got your hands on, but it sort of slipped through your fingers. You got any stories about that, Steve?
Yeah, there's definitely one story that stands out. It's another federal equity case, and the bad guy had some ties to Turkey, and my forensic accountants, after about probably about 2 to 3 weeks, traced money through about 4, 5, 6 banks in the United States, and through subpoenas and frankly a lot of cooperation with the banks and the SEC's help, we were able to pretty quickly get some of the missing bank statements. And we then traced money to Turkey. And I ended up retaining lawyers in Turkey and found out that there are laws in Turkey that somewhat mirror the fraudulent transfer laws here in the United States, and the remedies available in connection with fraudulent transfers, with one big exception. And in Turkey, that exception is that you have to have a criminal indictment for the folks in Turkey. There really is no equivalent to the civil folks in Turkey. It's all criminal. And they said they knew where the money was. We gave them the bank statements, and it was in excess of $5 million. And they said, call us as soon as you have a criminal indictment. Until then, leave us alone. And it was too early in the case. And although the individual is criminally indicted, those funds were long gone, a year after the fact. So I had to walk away from over $5 million just because of that nuance in Turkey, even though we knew where the money was and knew the person that had it.
That's a frustrating one. Dave, do you have a story?
So I do. I got tons of stories. But I had a lawyer actually sit at my desk and cry one time. So that's probably worth telling. I had an attorney who had a judgment against a dentist who was uninsured and had caused some type of bad damage and had a judgment in the hundreds of thousands of dollars and was looking to enforce it. And I had located an account for him, again, using those suitable pretexts. This is back when I was a private investigator, and we had located an account. It had in the hundreds of thousands, in the range of 100 to 200. It wasn't going to pay off the judgment entirely, but it was going to make a good down payment on this. Or if he could seize it, if the attorney could seize it, it was at least going to bring about a swift settlement of the case. But the attorney didn't have his writ issued, so he needed to get a writ of execution and sheriff's instructions and get them to the bank. And the attorney was a civil litigator. He had never enforced anything in his life, didn't really have a clue of where to begin. And in his process of dealing with the clerks and numerous attempts to try to get the writ issued, which is, it's kind of a technical thing. If you're not used to doing it, the delay can be excruciating. But in that time, we're watching the balance. This was back in the day when you would call on the telephone and punch in to check your balance, to check your balances day by day. And we sat as the attorney tried to get a writ issued, get the proper sheriff's instructions done, and get the bank served. we watched day by day the balance just slowly drip away to nothing. And it was, you know, it was just a devastating experience, more for him than for me. But as I said, he genuinely did. He sat at my desk and cried, you know,
Oh,
through the frustration of dealing with the clerks that were, you know, just hard to deal with.
oh yeah. Oh, that's a sad story. All right, well, let's move into sort of another phase of the case, which is the discovery, the document discovery, right? You know, there are the sad stories, but there's also, you know, you actually find the smoking gun, right? That's always a good thing. I don't know, anyone have a story? Steve, you have any smoking gun stories for us?
Yeah, a ton. There was one interesting case where the when we took over the company, the desktops had been cleaned out. Many files had been deleted, and some of them, it appeared as though they had been purposely corrupted. They had an email server that also had been, all of the emails had been removed. This was pre-cloud. And so the emails from the email server had been removed in addition to deleted from numerous desktops. Probably 3-4 days into the case, again, a big office, we came across an obscure drawer in somebody's office, and it had a bunch of, we didn't really know what they were. It turned out that they were backup tapes, and they were the backup tapes for the server. So they were really good about deleting the emails and corrupting important files. They were terrible about remembering to take and destroy the backup files for their server. And we were able to recover everything up until, I think it was 2 days before we took over, was the last backup. And that saved the day. So if they had taken the backups, would have been very, very difficult. So we were pretty lucky to find that.
Wow. Hey, Olivia, chime in anytime if you have a story on any of these topics as well.
We're good. I'm listening. I'm listening.
And David, what about you? Do you have a smoking gun story?
So yeah, I do have a smoking gun story. Now, I've practiced almost the entirety of my career in civil litigation, like all this kind of stuff that you guys are talking about, I did. But a year and a half ago, I went over into the criminal prosecutions world, and within about a month or so, I was on the stand in a murder case, which, you know, for an accountant, that's a pretty, you know, that's a pretty interesting experience. And this was a case where there were 2 canceled checks, cashier's checks, that I would accurately characterize as smoking guns. I really would. It was a cold case from 1990, a murder of an elder victim out in Palm Springs, whose body was found in the desert. And there were bank records. She had 2 Swiss bank accounts. Her and her husband, who predeceased, had 2 Swiss bank accounts that held about $200,000. And the case file contained, you know, sufficient information on those Swiss bank accounts to trace them through to an account at the Bank of Anguilla in the Caribbean. And that Bank of Anguilla issued 2 cashier's checks drawn on the Bank of America International. And the case file had these 30-year-old cashier's checks in them. They're made payable to the defendant, the suspect in the murder, $170,000, one for $100,000, one for $70,000. And the endorsement of it has his blue ink signature. So on the stand, I testified, I'm familiar with this man's signature. That is his signature. And I explained to the jury what the meaning of a cashier's check was. And I testified to the jury that this man had signed these checks and negotiated these instruments at branches of Bank of America here in California. And I wasn't there for closing, but I told the prosecutor, look, get these checks and pass them around to the jury. And I feel it was a case where he didn't take the stand, but you know, you can make a witness or a defendant can make excuses and deliver, you know, hours of testimony about why something didn't happen and why, you know, he wasn't there. But you put that check in the jury's hands, and it's very hard to overcome that. And the prosecutor came to me afterwards and said, you know, he felt that that was really, you know, those were the two linchpins that put this guy away, because he was the sole recipient of the victim's money, and there was really no way around that with those checks.
Wow, that's compelling. That's another good, you know, practice pointer. You know, put the evidence in their hands. That's compelling. You know, I was going to ask the question, you know, does anyone have an effective or productive discovery technique that they've used? And I thought of my answer to that question, and my answer to that question is a banana. I had a case where I you know, took over a business that was supposedly a brilliant operating business, making lots of money. And, you know, I get in there the first day and we start answering the phones as the calls are coming in, and we realize it's a fraud and what's going on, but we can't quite figure out what the fraud is. And so I start taking the depositions of the relevant people, and I took the deposition of the assistant to the CEO, who was, you tell, a little shaken by the whole thing, and she had something she wanted to say, but she wasn't saying it, you know. And so I put her under oath, and she took the Fifth Amendment to every question I asked. And I started at, you know, 10 a.m. and at about 4 in the afternoon. I mean, I've asked 1,000 of questions, and she's asserted the fifth 1,000 times, and I'm just bound and determined to give. And she's like, I'm so tired, I'm so hungry. And I said, well, I have more questions. I said, you know, I have a banana in my office. They said, you want it? She's like, you know, so I gave her the banana. It gave her just enough energy to decide to sing like a canary. She told me the whole fraud after a whole day in a banana. And it turned out she had a stack of CDs with all of the real records in her garage because the CEO had asked her to keep them in the garage. So that's my discovery technique, to find surprising information in places. All right, well, so let's move to the litigation phase of the case, right? Often we end up in litigation trying to find the assets and figure out what went down. So Steve, what's the most unusual defendant that you've sued?
Well, it was a very unusual, I'll give you two. One of them actually ended up being a law firm, and we came an inch away from suing them. We ultimately didn't have to. It was a law firm that pretty much everybody this evening would know. And they were paid funds that they claimed that they had researched and knew were clean. It was a very sizable retainer. And we asked them about it, and they said, no, they vetted the money and came from sources outside of the Ponzi scheme, because obviously funds derived from the Ponzi scheme by their very nature are stolen funds. And as it turns out, the funds, the client, surprise, surprise, the client had lied to the law firm, and we presented the law firm with the evidence, and the partner was literally shaken to his core and said that this could, you know, impact his career with the law firm, and almost begged us not to say anything. And we ended up having a confidential settlement agreement. And the most important thing about the settlement wasn't really so much the money as it was the confidential nature of the settlement. This firm did not want the world to know that they had taken dirty money. Another situation in a Ponzi scheme case, when an investor invests funds, and when that investor then receives all of their funds back, that's a return of their funds. However, when you have an investor that has all of their funds returned plus a return on the funds, then that means that they're casually known as a winner. And in a Ponzi scheme, being a winner is a no-no. And there was an individual who, I don't remember the dollar amount, but it was pretty significant, hundreds of thousands of dollars. And he made a profit. So we placed demand on him, and he fought us, and I think that we ended up we did file a complaint against him. It finally came out that he had donated a sizable portion of the money to the Church of Scientology. And he said that he went to the church and asked them to return the money, and it was a fight. And this was over about a 6-month period. And we were considering going directly to the church. At the end of the day, he was able to get about 80% of the money back, but they excommunicated him, which was tragic. And he was literally on the phone crying, tears on the phone, saying, I have the money, but I've lost my church. And, you know, I reserved comment about the church's conduct because we provided every evidence that the money was obtained improperly. And so, you know, I'm glad we didn't have to sue the church. Very, very unfortunate, though, that what this individual went through, not only having to return the money that he thought was his, but having that happen with the church. So that was a very unique, unusual situation.
You know, in those types of fraud cases, particularly in Ponzi scheme cases, money is often spent just directly on charitable contributions. And one of the tougher calls that fiduciaries have, you know, in wanting to recover money for the victims is whether or not you pursue a charitable organization. And it's, you know, and I represent a lot of receivers, and they have as opposite opinions as they, absolutely, why wouldn't you? Or no, why would you? You know, and those are tough calls to make. But, you know, Steve, you made an important point about, you know, again, sort of a practice pointer, but you actually have almost a little bit of leverage with the confidentiality aspect of that, because a lot of those folks do not want to end up in the news. Not that you want to hold it over their heads, but it gives you an opportunity and a little window to try to resolve those things before you actually get into a litigation posture.
Oh, believe me, the poker game was played. I distinctly remember saying something about a report to the court that would include accounting documents as exhibits to the report, which of course would evidence where the money flowed, and that set the panic bells off. So it wasn't a threat. I wasn't threatening them. I wasn't extorting them or doing anything untoward. I was just simply making a casual comment that, you know, no problem, you know, because I have to get approval. You have to go through a litigation plan with the court. And one of the things that you have to do is you have to justify that there's a reasonable belief, that you have a reasonable belief that you're going to recover funds sufficient to warrant the cost. And I said, when we seek authority for litigation, we're going to have to do some prove up to the court. And I think we settled the next day.
Okay. All right. So another big aspect, Dave, did you have something to say?
Kathy, yeah. I was wondering, you mentioned that, you know, a lot of these Ponzi schemers do give generously to charity. Have you ever run across Ponzi scheme defendants that have actually invested in other Ponzi schemes or in other fraudulent investment schemes?
You know, sad to say, I have, and more than once. And, you know, in one of them, it was actually the banana case. I was really shocked that the perpetrator in my case had in fact taken stolen investor dollars and invested in an even bigger, more sinister scheme in another state. And that other state had completely sealed the record, because it was, to this day, I don't know the details behind it. And she cooperated enough that they just sentenced her to 1 year of house arrest, because they wanted to keep it all on the down low and hush hush and just kind of quietly punish, kind of slap her on the wrist, even though she ran a $90 million scheme. So, yep, it happens. And when you start to involve different federal agencies and different state agencies, you know, you just lose control at that point. So, yeah. Yeah.
I had a case.
mention it because I was in a case with a guy who was running against a guy who was running a boiler room, and he was really, I mean, it was close, but he was running a boiler room and investment scheme. And I was doing an interview with the auditor of that company, because they had audited financial statements. And he told me and produced documents that the Ponzi, or the investment scammer, had twice paid out to recipients who had sent him emails stating that he was the heir to a Irish, legacy, and they just needed $50,000 to process the paperwork, and he was going to be a millionaire. And the guy fell for that, the same scheme, like two chapters of it, to the tune
With
of
somebody else's money.
with somebody else's money. Yeah.
Great. Olivia, do you have a story?
I was just going to say, I had a Ponzi guy, and both his accountant and his attorney were running their own Ponzi schemes. So I found I was investigating the key guy, and then as part of that investigation, I discovered the attorney and the accountant doing their own deals.
I guess serves them right? Or
I know.
they're playing with somebody else's money, so maybe it's easier to be risky and try to make it all. What I have found is that perpetrators, when I am close enough to them to be communicating with them, trying to cooperate with them to figure out how to get the money back, almost all of them are like, I was just one deal away from getting all this money, and it was going to take care of all of my problems. So I think there's a little bit of that mentality. I stole all this money, but if I just do this one other thing, it's going to make it all better.
Come
So
back,
that's
yes.
probably what draws them to investing in other Ponzi schemes. All right, so another aspect of cases that we see a lot are you end up communicating with a variety of parties. Like in a receivership case, Steve, you would communicate probably with the creditors or the defrauded victims. Is there anything that you have learned that's kind of surprising? That's sort of a gift too in a case that helps you out?
Yes, there was one case I was very surprised to learn after interacting with a particular creditor or claimant who seemed to have a pretty intricate knowledge of things, and was kind of playing games a little bit with me, I felt, but we ended up having a dialogue back and forth, and she didn't really understand the process of how the claims procedure worked, but she was pretty persistent, and one thing led to another, and I found out that she was actually the ex-wife of the perpetrator. And as the realization was hitting her that her investment was worth pennies on the dollar, she became more and more angry, and she started singing. And she had not been involved in the operation. She had been divorced from him for quite some time, but apparently investment in the company was part of the divorce settlement, and she learned that that settlement was not exactly worth the paper that it was printed on. So, and I had no idea. She had been, I think she was remarried, and I didn't put two and two together. So that was kind of a surprise and quite a gift.
I saw a case that came out years after the Madoff decision, the Madoff Ponzi scheme case, where the divorced couple were fighting over that because, one of them had gotten in the divorce this great Madoff account, which turned out to be nothing. And how does that change the property settlement? Anyway, all right, let's talk a little bit about working with criminal authorities. Have you had that experience, Olivia? And what have you drawn from that?
A lot of my work is working with law enforcement, and it doesn't start off that way, but it ends up being that way. And one case involved Cars.com. My client in North Carolina bought a car for $26,000, and she purchased cars through Cars.com 2 or 3 times before, very successfully. This time she got the car, except that she didn't get the car. She wired the funds to a bank outside of Seattle, and she had been working with or talking to the car dealer in Utah. And the car dealer would call her and say, your car's on its way, it's coming on a truck, it'll be there in a day. And she kept waiting for the car to arrive, and of course it never arrived. And by that time, her wired funds had disappeared. So somehow she found me, and the two of us spent probably 2.5 years on this case. And why would I do that? It was so fascinating. And she was also a former whistleblower, and she worked like hell. And so the two of us worked this thing together. And we obviously tried to find the dealer in Utah, who of course was fiction. And we ended up putting a website together for, has anybody heard of this car dealer in Utah? And obviously we went to the banks, and we discovered that it was a whole gang that would set up these fake car dealers using existing VIN numbers that they probably got through parking attendants or whatever. So they'd advertise a legitimate car on cars.com. Somebody unsuspecting like Linda from North Carolina would then buy the car. But when I actually we went through Carfax, when I actually found her car, it was in some guy's garage, and I called him and I said, is your car missing? No, it's in the garage. It's my wife's car. And I said, well, it's just been sold on cars.com, and but it wasn't the real car. So we ended up through this two and a half year period working with law enforcement. But one of the best sources was an officer in Alhambra. And he was so angry about having his constituents be ripped off through this same kind of gang, that he was a terrific lead for us and introduced us to other law enforcement throughout the country. And one of the reasons that it's such a troublesome thing for law enforcement is they don't have the resources. And for an internet scam like this, they really don't know what to do. For example, Linda's, when she went to the North Carolina authorities, they just kind of took the report and then did nothing about it. So ultimately, we ended up through this Alhambra officer. He introduced us to the FBI and then to Interpol. Ultimately, the gang, it's a Romanian gang, and they made sure that the gang members were brought back to the United States. They're now behind bars. There are 2 people that are on the FBI's most wanted list in terms of their computer side of things, and they're still wanted. But it was a success story, and it's by just working it. And so even though I never got paid, it was one of the most satisfying cases. And it was satisfying because the law enforcement didn't have the resources to do it themselves. And but it was satisfying that ultimately the bad guys got caught.
Yeah, wow, that's quite a story too.
Yeah.
So oftentimes there are parallel civil and criminal proceedings, right? And so like Steve, you as a receiver, you're handling the civil side of things, but if there's a parallel criminal proceeding, have you done stuff right or wrong in working with the authorities there?
No, I've always been on the side of the good guys.
Okay, well, that's good. And Steve, what about you in your receiver world?
Well, you know what? No, I take it back. Kathy, we had a really kind of tragic case having to do with elder abuse. The perpetrators were 2 doctors that specialized in high net worth individuals, and they worked with as a sort of a lead generator to investment scoundrels. And it was a whole network, a regional network that preyed on elders of high net worth individuals. And my client was one of the people. Her dad ultimately died, but he was ripped off. And we packaged this case as a criminal referral and to the U.S. Attorney's Office. It turns out that somebody on the U.S. Attorney's Office role, an employee, was potentially part of this. So that's still being investigated. It was shocking. So, yeah.
Yep, yep, sometimes. And what about the other two of you? Steve, do you have any experience with that?
I certainly, in the vast majority of the federal equity receivership cases, there are parallel criminal actions or criminal investigations that are going on. One case in particular involved a variety of assets in different states. Some of them were liquid, some of them were illiquid, and I was dealing with FBI and the AUSA assigned to the case. And at the end of the day, notwithstanding the cooperation that the AUSA said that they would provide me and that I expected back from them in terms of document sharing, they ended up having me do a lot of work with my forensic accountants to locate assets, and the estate spent tens of thousands of dollars to get reports together to verify and validate the fact that certain assets belong to the estate. The AUSA then swooped in and said, no, we're taking them, and we're going to be doing a distribution back to the victims through the criminal process. But the civil receivership estate bore the burden of all the forensic accounting. And I asked them about that initially, and he lied. And I was not happy about it, and I let them know about it. But at the end of the day, it wasn't a fight that I was going to fight. I had another situation in a case, Kathy, which you know very well, where I took over the location, and after the offices were closed, we put a notice up on the front door that if anybody had any questions about this business, they could call my office, and taken over pursuant to court order. I think I was out of town, and I got a call from the local LAPD, who told me that they were at the premises and they had a search warrant and they were going to be going in and seizing everything. And I said, no, you're not. And the guy said, well, yes, we are. We see your name. We're just letting you know. Give us the combination to the security system. And I said, I need you to understand, I've been appointed by the court as the receiver, and the business itself is under lock and key pursuant to a federal court order. And he said, I don't care what order you have. I have a search warrant, and I'm sending it to you. And he found out where I was, and I told him where I was, and I think he emailed it. And I just said, I don't care what you have. If you go in that premises, I'm going to hold you in contempt. And I'm going to go to court, and I'm going to hold you and your department in contempt of court. We have a jurisdictional issue. I have a federal court order. You're local law enforcement. You are ordered to stay away. Do not go in, and get your sergeant on the phone right now. And that's how the conversation went. And ultimately what happened was unbeknownst to me, I think in Georgia, there is a particular office of the Federal Trade Commission that deals with interagency relations, and that I relayed the information to the lawyers at the FTC, and who put me in touch with the lady in Georgia, and she said, thank God you did what you did. You had every right to do it, and they got in touch with local law enforcement. Ultimately, what happened was we did what we needed to do with the records. The police had been conducting a criminal investigation for a long time, and we ended up packaging everything up and giving it to them because we imaged everything we needed. And that sergeant that I got into such a spat with said that ultimately having a receiver was the greatest thing that the police department had ever seen, because I gave them reports, everything was maintained, it was organized, and I ultimately provided every level of cooperation. It's just that it had to be done in a certain way. And so I didn't feel comfortable threatening a police officer. And if he could have seen my face over the phone, sweating bullets, maybe I wouldn't have been as convincing, but I used my fancy, confident receiver voice and got him to stand down.
Yeah, that's quite a story. I'm sure he went home that first day and told his wife what a not nice person receivers can be.
Yeah.
But good for you. And it sounds like it was a positive outcome for everybody involved.
It was. Yep.
So along the way, right, when you take over possession, and there can be these battles over documents and stuff, what's a lesson to be learned from, you walk in and you touch all of this stuff, the computers and the documents and everything else, and there may be criminal authorities that are interested in it. What's the most important thing, Steve, that you would say you have to worry about in that context?
Well, when a receiver takes over a business, there are allegations that are being made, and I always have my forensic accountants with me day one, as well as my computer forensics. And ordinarily, if a receiver is appointed on an emergency basis, on an ex parte basis, ordinarily there is a confirmation hearing not too long after the receiver is initially appointed. In federal court, it's typically going to be 10 days or so. And so a receiver has a tremendous amount of work to do in a very compressed amount of time. And it's a fine line, because if a receiver goes in and shuts down a company that is legitimate, or a portion of the company is legitimate, a receiver could find himself or herself in hot water. So I always work very closely with my forensic accountants to try to verify the allegations that were made by the agency that had me appointed, to in fact confirm that there is no legitimacy, or if there is only some legitimacy, is it appropriate to continue that portion of the business? And I really, really rely on my forensic accountants to do a trace of the source and use of funds, and those reports are included as exhibits to the court. So I think it's really, really important for forensic accountants to understand the pressure that a receiver is under. And then I also certainly use private investigators as needed, to locate assets and try to uncover the truth when things on the surface may look fishy, and it's amazing what you can find. There are parallel companies in many of these cases as well, where maybe a company started legit and there was a spinoff, and then you can expand the scope of the entire receivership. But you've got to make sure that you're not actually operating something that's illegal to begin with. And conversely, you need to make sure that you're not going to be shutting down something that is legitimate, where the receiver could find himself or herself being sued by the defendant.
So going back to your very first story about your Beverly Hills mansion brothel, how long did it take you to decide not to operate that? Is this...
I thought about it, after a couple of cocktails and interviews with the employees. It took me a while, but I ultimately decide probably not the type of business that I'd be operating. So.
Well, I do know actually some bankruptcy trustees and receivers do end up making some hard decisions where, it's like there's some form of pornography, which is maybe lawful, but not terribly tasteful, and so, what's the best way to maximize the return to the investors there? But hopefully no fraud is involved as well. All right, well, so let's maybe hit our last topic about our personal safety in these types of cases, right? There are definitely, we've all run into different scenarios, and there are probably some lessons learned that maybe we can share here. So I don't know, do you have a sort of a funniest story in hindsight? Because it wasn't funny at the time. I don't know, Steve, do you have one?
Yeah, kind of ironic, and it was humorous looking back on it, because the guy was so smug. This is actually the same guy that had the fish. So he very, very rough, gruff, kind of imposing, large, imposing guy, very, very confident. We all showed up, and we had FBI agents, DOJ, AUSA, and then we also had local law enforcement, because it was known that this individual, his first name is David, and I think he got 12 years in prison ultimately. It was known that David had a gun, and he was able to carry a gun legally. And so, but he was just really, really smug, and, no, you're not going to do anything. I'm going to talk to my lawyer. So we ultimately went to the conference room and started interviewing him, and he was just obnoxious. And we ended up going back to his office, because he said that there were some documents that he would show us. And he sat down at his desk, and then one of the FBI agents came up and said, "By the way, Mr. So-and-so, do you have a firearm?" And he looked at all of us and said, I'm not sure. He said, "Well, what do you mean?" "Well, maybe." "Well, is the firearm here in your office?" "Yeah, it could be. It just, I just really don't know. I don't think I have to even tell you that." And then, behind me are these, folks coming closer and closer. And, he was just being obnoxious and wouldn't answer the question. And then finally said, well, yeah, maybe there's a pistol in my desk. What's it to you? I mean, playing the game. So finally, the officer came up and said, open the desk drawer now, which he did. And there was a revolver. And he said, is that the gun you were talking about? Well, I guess it is. Do you have any more firearms in this office? I need an answer right now. And I mean, it was like something out of a movie. And he said, no, that's it. And so he said, the FBI guy said, take the gun and place it on the desk. And which he did. And he says, is that gun loaded? And he said, gee, I don't know. What do you mean you don't know? I need an answer now. And he still played games. So at that point, the FBI guy approached him, and he had in his hand like this. He put the hand down right above the desk, and he opened his hand, and 6 bullets fell out onto the desk. And the FBI agent said, no, Mr. So-and-so, your gun's not loaded, but thanks anyway. Well, while we had been interviewing him in the conference room, he'd searched the office, found the gun, took the bullets out. And I later learned this was just a huge ploy to just cut the guy off at the kneecaps. And he literally got smaller in his seat. He became meek and mild, and the entire tone of the interview changed like that. And they just nailed him. So it was pretty uptight at the time. They didn't share with me that they had the bullets. I can look back and laugh about it now, but it was pretty tense.
Oh my gosh. Yeah, you never know what you're going to encounter. I had a case where the debtor was in a bankruptcy case was really mad at me because for about 2 years I was really persistent to uncover the fraud and find the money, and I finally did, and it was enough money to get everybody paid back, and there was extra money, and he was fighting me on my fees, and he did not like me much. Well, he told his son, an adult son at some point, that he had hired 2 Colombian hitmen to take me out.
Oh my God.
It was a very intentional and detailed threat, which was quite nerve-wracking. And I represented a bankruptcy trustee, and we communicated with the U.S. Marshals, to say, geez, what do we do? Because I was watching my back there. I was kind of scary. And the U.S. Marshals wrote a long, lovely letter back to my client, the bankruptcy trustee, and says, we have confirmed he is armed and dangerous. He has registered weapons. And the U.S. Marshals can offer protection to you, bankruptcy trustee, but we cannot offer any protection to your lawyer.
Oh my God.
So that was delightful. My firm at the time paid for me to valet park my car for about 6 months until the guy went to jail, not for that, but for tax fraud. He was also mad that I had uncovered the tax fraud. So you never know what you're going to encounter. Steve, you had one last little story about sort of a lesson learned in terms of guarding your own personal safety in cases like this.
Yeah, again, knock on wood, most of the situations haven't resulted in violence. I did have another case where I showed up at a building and somebody pointed a gun at me, and that was not pleasant. I came back the next day with it turned out that it was a known drug dealer, and the local police were happy I was there and came back with SWAT and dogs and did a full takeover. But what I've learned over having done this for many years, including people leaving threatening voicemails, one individual left so many of them that we called the FBI, and that individual was prosecuted criminally for terrorist threats. Our front lobby, it's secured. You need a pass, a key code to get in. I don't want my car to be parked anywhere where it's visible to any of the employees. I don't want them to know what my license plate is. I don't, I'm try to be, relatively careful about social media. I don't have any videos, for example, on my website of myself. I just don't really, look, there's LinkedIn, there's Facebook. I mean, we're all visible in the world now, and it's more and more. But you just don't know who you're dealing with. And I never want people to know, what my license plate is or what type of car I drive. And I've had situations where, I've even been concerned that I've been followed before. So we do take security seriously here and I'm actually at a real office. I'm not working from home. But you just never know who you're going to deal with and when that surprise may occur. And I have to really decide if I'm going to have law enforcement accompany me during these takeovers because it's just the surprise element that you have to be prepared for.
Yeah, yeah. Well, on that paranoid note, I think we've shared some experiences. Hopefully you guys have picked up some practice pointers along the way. We are happy to field any questions that anybody may have. You can go ahead and put them in the chat. I think that's probably the best way, and we'll stick around for a little while. Unless any one of my panelists have another fun story they want to share, we'll open it up for some questions at this point.
So Kathy, while we're waiting to see if any questions pop up, I'll just mention I've testified on a number of occasions that particular business entities were being operated as a Ponzi scheme. And my authority in coming to those conclusions, I've always used as my authority that reference book that's behind you to your left, the Ponzi book that you wrote with Stephen Rhodes. And have never had it challenged and have never had one of my opinions about Ponzi finding undermined. So I just thought I'd
That's a good plug.
Thank you for that plug, much appreciated. Any questions? So Becky had mentioned at the beginning of the program that for anyone who needs MCLE credit for lawyers in California, I am able to offer that credit. And so if you would like credit, do email me with your state bar number and let me know that at kphelps@diamondmccarthy.com. And I'd be happy to get you a certificate and the credit. Any other questions? No?
No, and I'm not seeing any questions on the, hopefully people have been listening to us this whole time and we haven't just dropped off and it's been the four of us.
I see a lot of names. So, all right, Becky, is there any other business that we need to take care of? Oh, we can't hear you.
Oops, sorry about that. Yeah, I don't have anything else. Yeah, if anybody has any questions and you don't want to be bashful and you can unmute and chime in. Otherwise, we can wrap this up. Thank you to our amazing panelists. This was very fun, very engaging. I mean, one thing that I'd love to hear so much are war stories and for everybody to share their experiences with the group. Just a quick note, be on the lookout for your CP certificates. And as Kathy had mentioned, if you would like CLE, please email her with your bar number. And then in addition, we will be having a February event. It will be on February 24th at 5:30 p.m. And our topic will be anatomy of investment fraud. And our speaker will be Sarah Lewis from Miracle Mile Advisors. So if nobody else has anything to ask or to add, I think we can say salut to David and sign off, and everybody have a wonderful evening.
Good night.
Thank you all. Thank you.
Okay, good night. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.